Hi guys, guess I should take, there's a glare on my glasses. Hope you're doing well. Here is lecture 1 as promised. Let me share it with you. Let me get through it with you and we will get you back to your life. I hope you enjoy it, or at least find the information interesting. This is about African American rhetoric, of course, this women's rhetoric, and this is the second one. We started, I believe, the first one before the break. Here are the readings for this lecture, and these readings are listed on your syllabus. We're going to go roughly in the order of the topics of the syllabus, so there are no major changes. There are no major changes there. The main topics for this lecture are intersectionality, respectability politics, womanism and black feminism, rhetorical strategies. I wanted to at least look at one text and delineate some of the strategies that maybe you will be able to use in your paper, and then intra-racial, intragender conflict, and then, so that's conflict between the genders within the race. The backdrop, or the context for the rhetoric of African American women in the senses we're talking about is a patriarchal society. And the patriarchal society, as it says here, sets up the double discrimination that African American women face, right? Being discriminated against or not having as many opportunities on account of their race and also on account of their gender. Intersectionality, I showed you a clip of Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term, who used it to talk about the ways in which different social identities will kind of coalesce within individuals or within groups to create particular barriers. So all of these women, for example, all of these women are African American, and so they're discriminated against on account of race. But Sojourner Truth, whom we've spoken about, who was a slave, she was freed, but she was a slave at one point. So it wasn't just race, it was not just gender, but it was also her status in society, her status as a slave that created oppression, more oppression and barriers for her. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Mary Church Terrell, who was affluent and lives in, as her speech talks about, in Washington, D.C., and she was sort of at the pinnacle of Washington, D.C. society. She was highly educated, from an affluent family. Her father was the first black millionaire in Tennessee, and then she was married to a judge who attended Harvard. So her situation and Sojourner Truth's was very different. They're also different in terms of their appearance and what that might mean, and the opportunities that might either close or open for especially women in society who are judged on their looks. I want us to look at Mary Church Terrell's speech, what it means to be colored. It was she delivered it. It was actually a speech and also an article in 1906. And I want us to look at it through the lens of race and rhetoric and ideology first. Of course, it's about race, or more particularly about racism. We're looking at her rhetoric of race, talking about and indicting the racist actions and a racist system in Washington, D.C. And there are also ideology. I also want us to look at the ideology of class that we see in her speech. Some of the rhetorical features that I will point to, and you can read for yourself, would be first-hand testimony, meaning she's talking about her own experiences. Some of that appears in the speech. The second is anecdotes, lots of anecdotes and experiences, or secondhand experiences for her, of her friends or people that she is acquainted with. And then, of course, some of the themes in it are the lack of opportunities for even the most talented blacks. Actually, it's black women, so most of the examples of women. Intersectionality is also kind of a lens through which we might look at it, because she's talking about race, she's talking about gender, but again, the frames that she uses and the ways in which she talks about it clearly reflects an ideology of class. And then there's also the idea of respectability politics. You see a sense of, there's an undertone of respectability politics, and that's, as it says here, just people, mainly women within the race, sort of policing the actions of the black masses so that they'll make themselves more palatable or appeal to whites, and it was controversial then, and it still continues to be controversial. And in fact, some would say we are at the end of the post politics, respectability politics era. Evelyn Higginbotham wrote the first book about respectability politics, and she said, though, we don't need to be too hard on women who, in their time, imposed these strictures or tried to impose these standards on the race. They were, in their own way, trying to fight racism and sexism. Even women who were in the church were strong and they were powerful. And while, yes, they abided by a hierarchy and perhaps even embraced a traditional gender hierarchy, they were no less advancing women's causes, and also the causes of the race with all of their work and their activities, especially those within the community. And this is just the politics of respectability. This is a clip that an excerpt, sorry, that I lifted from an article that I read by Tanisha Ford, who actually does this incredible story about the women of the civil rights movement and how you can look at the shift in clothing as a reflection of a shift in consciousness about the movement. She said that she argues here that the clothing and the hairstyles that they would shift to were first a product of just kind of it was just more practical with their activism to not have to dress up. But then the other part of that had to do with the work that they were doing with rural Southerners, and these were sharecroppers, and the sharecroppers would dress in overalls made of denim, and so to show sort of camaraderie with or solidarity, I should say, solidarity with these, with the people that they were trying to help support to get to vote. They started to dress in denim, and so it ultimately though became a kind of a statement, a way to, as she says here, to transgress the black middle class worldview that marginalized certain types of women and marginalized particular displays of blackness and black culture. So there was a rejection of this way of thinking. And this is just an image of that. On the one hand, you see there's a change. The change is starting to take place. You see the women who are dressed in dresses. Men had started to wear overalls, and then over here you see the women who would later start to wear overalls. This is a clip that I would hope that you would watch, but I'm going to get through this lecture because I promised you only 15 minutes. But this is the Black Panthers and their dress and what their dress signified for them and how their dress was important in the statement that they were making, but also in the reactions that it got from people outside of the organization, especially others in the African American community. Another thing I want to talk about regarding African American women is the intra-racial strife between black men and black women. African American women resisted some of the patriarchy within their own community, especially women who were active in the civil rights movement. They were, of course, privy to and perhaps even participated in the very robust women's rights movement that, of course, was aflame during the 1960s. There were several liberatory movements that were percolating, were part of the turmoil of the 1960s. And so these women in these organizations realized, like women did, I guess in the 19th century, that wait a minute, we're still being discriminated against within our own organizations. And this organization, which we'll talk about when we talk about the civil rights movement, is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And the women in SNCC created a position paper, and it was complaining the complaints that they had against the way the males of their organization treated them. So, for example, number 8, any woman in SNCC, no matter what her position or experience, has been asked to take minutes in a meeting when she and other women are outnumbered by men. So it was assumed that they would take minutes. They never had any real power in the organization. One of SNCC's main administrative officers apologizes for the appointment of women as the interim project director in the Mississippi area. So it's just like it was just taken for granted that women would not hold leadership positions, that it would be black men. But these women rebelled against that and wrote this position. It's a powerful piece of rhetoric. This would also make a very interesting paper topic. And then this culminates in, I guess it was last year, or was it, yes, 2018, when Beyonce performed at Coachella, the end of respectability politics. And it's just where, she's at the pinnacle of her career, and she makes this statement about blackness. And this is a predominantly white audience, but she embraces, as she did in the video formation, she embraces black culture. And so black culture and all of and the forms of blackness that used to not be perceived as respectable, and that's been part of that. Her sexuality and the sexuality that's sort of the contours of her brand certainly was a rejection of that respectability politics. But when you add the sexuality plus the political overtones, then you get kind of this statement about who she's talking to, who she's speaking to, and her stance, and perhaps even the transformation of her brand. Womanism and black feminism. I alluded just a moment ago to the SNCC women and how many of them were probably privy to and members of the women's rights movement, and just the strife, the rights, the struggle, the assertion that women had rights and that they wanted to level out the gender hierarchy. Well, the conversation among black women is, what does that mean for black women, given the racial, the racism that black men face too, and how much do they align themselves with this feminist movement, this white feminist movement that may in some way inhibit or undermine African American men. And so Alice Walker wants to distinguish black feminism, or women's strength and women's independence, from white feminism, and she calls it womanism, right? And she embraces this nationalistic philosophy, and we will talk about nationalism, black nationalism, when we talk about Malcolm X. But she embraces this nationalist philosophy where it's almost like a separate. We're separate. We're different. Patricia Hill Collins, though, who elaborates more on black feminism, wants to align black women's efforts, even as they critique the movement, with the global movement, with women, and be in solidarity with women around the around the globe, because these I guess issues, she said, are important to African American women as well. And so, her concern is, how do these issues in particular affect black women? We have during this time, a woman who sits at kind of the intersection of kind of the women's rights movement and also the civil rights movement, or the movement for racial equality, is Shirley Chisholm. And Shirley Chisholm, was the first African American member, was the first black female member of Congress. I have a video here of her. I'm not going to show it, but I am encouraging you to watch the video of Shirley Chisholm. I do want to take a moment to look at her speech. And the speech itself is a feminist speech. It is promoting the equal rights. It's promoting the Equal Rights Amendment. There was a pretty successful move. It was we were well on our way to passing, amending the Constitution with this Equal Rights Amendment clause, and it was designed to protect women. I think the language was fairly neutral. But it was specifically a stricter. It was greater strictures against discrimination, and women were going to be the main benefactors of that. And Shirley Chisholm didn't seem to have a problem with working with feminists, even as she worked stridently and forcefully for her impoverished New York district. But if we take a look at this speech, this is just how she articulated her views about how she combines feminism and also the rights for racial equality. There's a calculated system of prejudice that lies unspoken behind that question. Why is it acceptable for women to be secretaries, librarians, and teachers, but totally unacceptable for them to be managers, administrators, lawyers, doctors, and members of Congress? More than half of the population of the United States is female, but women occupy only 2% of the managerial positions. She also talks about this list of racial and ethnic inequality, as in the field of equal rights for blacks, Spanish Americans, the Indians, and other groups. Laws will not change such deep-seated problems overnight, but they can be used to provide protection for those who are most abused and to begin the process of evolutionary change by compelling the insensitive majority to re-examine its unconscious attitude. So there again, for her, racial issues and feminist issues can combine, can coalesce, can support, can bolster one another. So she is outstanding. She's outstanding in that way. They're critics of middle-class white feminism. If you notice here on the right, these are women in this black and white women in the 1970s who actually helped to derail the Equal Rights Amendment. They believed that feminism was an attack on traditional values and would change society fundamentally. And they were Phyllis Schlafly, who actually came here to Furman, I guess about a decade ago. She's since deceased. I think she's deceased recently, but she came here, and she was very eloquent and powerful in her criticism of the Equal Rights Amendment. So here's one group that shares in common with actually a contemporary voice that says that, this is notes from the women that a movement forgot. So Mickey Kendall, in her book, elaborates on the ways that white middle-class feminism doesn't meet the needs or talk about the concerns of lower income African American women, like food insecurity or food disparity, gun violence, lack of resources. Perceptions of African American women and what African American women have to kind of contend with. So it's a very insightful and incisive critique of the contemporary movement. And this book, this volume just came out last month. Telling stories of black men and women. Black women are documentarians. I wanted to feature them, wanted to at least have a slide that talks a little bit about projects that tell powerful stories about African American men and women that were once invisible. You have on the right side, you have Shola Lynch. Shola Lynch directed the documentary on Shirley Chisholm, Unbossed and Unbought, and it actually won a Peabody Award. And this is an interview that I hope that you will watch her talk about her documentary on Shirley Chisholm, and she's also done a documentary on Angela Davis, and I'll mention Angela Davis when we get to the Black Panther movement. And then the other side, you have Ava DuVernay, who did the documentary 13th. I recall that we looked at a video clip of Jay-Z with the graphics about mass incarceration. Well, 13th is about mass incarceration, and it's a really powerful amassing of evidence and stories and outcomes that really indict the criminal justice system. It's almost irrefutable that the justice system needs reforming, and I think both sides of the aisle would admit to that. Another interracial strife would be Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. This was, this predates, of course, um, the Kavanaugh hearing with Blasey Ford, I believe. I'm blanking on her name. Ford, who accused him of sexual misconduct with her when he was nominated to be on the Supreme Court, and this had happened in 1991, where Anita Hill did the same thing with Clarence Thomas. When you click on the link here, it will give you a summary of what happened here. This was extraordinary in that it was intraracial. It was the first time you had a black woman, a prominent black woman, a prominent black man in a prominent position, um, um, really trying to stop his nomination by sharing, what had happened to her. He was ultimately, like with Kavanaugh, confirmed, but it really kind of shook the community and divided the community as it did with the Kavanaugh hearings. But in terms of intraracial strife and the discourses where one group, women, have accused men of acting either disrespectfully or illegally, or not seeing them as full-fledged partners. And this is kind of the penultimate of that. Before I close, I wanted to talk about, though, to present a slide that at least pays homage to advancements, because there have been several advancements for racial advancements in general, and for African American women in particular. You have women who serve in the military, everyday women who serve in the military, raising great kids. You have people who are at the top of their careers and in their fields, in their profession, like Shonda Rhimes and Mae Jemison, who was an astronaut. And then you have Ursula Burns, who was the CEO, the first black woman to head Bed Bath and Beyond. And so you've got a number of these advancements. And so I put this slide in here, one, because I wanted us not to lose sight of that. Two, in your paper, I ask you, there's a transition paragraph where I ask you to talk about advancements that have been made, even as you're going to talk about, how the contemporary text that you've chosen, even as you talk about how it compares with some of the same challenges, you're going to also talk about what the advancements that have come, laws that have been passed, people who have made it at the top of their careers, have broken barriers, and made historic change, or made history. But we also want to keep sight of, beyond just as you tout and celebrate change, there are still barriers, and this is just a report about African American women and some of the barriers that they still face, and this is just these kinds of reports that look at statistics and look at trends are important to providing a baseline to providing a baseline for where the opportunities are, but also where there are barriers and where there are challenges. And sometimes these statistics and sometimes this research will also reveal, or point to ways that this can be addressed in a way that doesn't just help, but in a way that empowers. This was a paper idea. Barbara Jordan's statement on impeachment. You can look this up on YouTube. You can look at, there was Shirley Chisholm actually was the precursor for the 2018 freshman class of congresswomen, and it was a diverse class. And these women sort of owe kind of their position, their ability, the door being open for them to the bravery and the guts of Shirley Chisholm. So, but they are there. They are making statements. In some cases, they are making waves. They have made statements on the floors of Congress, and I thought maybe a comparison to Jordan's statements, one of her many statements, but the one on impeachment is particularly important. With some of the statements that these women have made is a great paper idea. And now we come to your journal exercise, and this is MCT is Mary Church Terrell. I talked about her earlier. In the journal, when you post this to your journal, please include the title. I'll be able to see the date and the time. We are not doing the speech that I covered, but there's another speech at this link, The Progress of Colored Women, that I would ask that you summarize for me. And then I also want you to find 3 contemporary speeches or writings or videos or websites and that will compare in their language, in their themes, in their arguments, in their ideas, or in some way that you can identify in a paragraph about them. So two paragraph tops about these and how they compare is sufficient. This is due Tuesday, March 24th at 4 p.m. in your journal. Not on Turnitin, but in your journal. That is all that I have for you today. I hope you have a great day, a great evening whenever you're going to watch this, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.